Welcome to my transparent watercolor tutorial for my painting Creek's Edge. The photograph on the right was a reference and inspiration for this painting. I often find that the trees and the plant life that live on the banks of waterways can be quite interesting. They have some nice shapes and textures, and the water and distant meadow proves to be a nice backdrop. This is a very simple sketch that I began with. You can see, if you look at the photograph, that there's just a few large major shapes and then a lot of plant, grass, leaves that I view more as textural qualities and patterns that I try and create, but I'm not going to sketch each and every branch or leaf. So I draw the major shapes of the trees, the land masses, the distant trees, the tree line there, and I keep it just as simple as that. You'll notice that I have masking fluid on this. After I put my sketch down, I randomly splattered masking fluid with a toothbrush over the work surface in areas closer to the bottom. I didn't do too much of it at the top, and that's to give me some nice textural qualities that I'm after. If I happen to get masking fluid in an area that I really don't want that texture, once the masking fluid's dry, I'll take a pickup eraser and remove it from that specific area before I begin to paint. I'm going to begin by applying a light wash of yellow ochre and raw umber to an area here that's kind of like the field or the meadow, and I'm using a 1-inch wash brush. I'm working on an 8 by 10 inch sheet of 140 pound cold press watercolor paper. So this 1-inch brush gives pretty good coverage with just a few strokes. So I have this very light wash, and into it I'm going to work wet and wet. I'm going to bring in another wash with some raw umber. Because I'm working wet and wet, I'm getting some nice soft edges and some nice gradation. And I'm going to do the same thing using a mixture of sap green, which also has a little bit of raw umber in it to neutralize it a bit. But this gives me this nice band of color that represents this field, and it's got some nice gradation and some nice soft edges. Now I'm going to start to put a wash in to represent this distant tree line. And a lot of times I would start with this band of color before the meadow area that I did, because a lot of times you have that softer edge when you're working from the tree lines down into the middle and foreground. However, if you take a look at this photograph, you can see that the edge of this meadow is pretty clean, has a pretty clean edge and a pretty defined edge, somewhat of a hard edge. It's not really soft. So I opted to put that middle band of color in to represent the meadow first, and then start with this band of green to represent the trees and the distant tree line second. So I have that harder edge at the bottom, and then I'm working my way up with some glazes. I could have turned this upside down at this point too and brought this glaze, have gravity work with me a little bit more, but sometimes I'll put a tone down and I'll work with lightening, making it lighter going up by changing the color or just using clear water, which I did there at the end. And I have that nice clean edge at the bottom. And I dried that middle band before I started this second band, or I would have had soft edges. But I want to drop some darker value into this band, so I'm still working wet and wet, and I'm bringing in a darker value green. This green has a bit of raw umber in it to darken it up. Now I'm going to come in and put even a bit darker green and a cooler green. I've taken my mixture of sap green that has a little raw umber, and I've added some royal blue to it. So I'm getting more of a blue-green tone here, and I'm dropping that still wet and wet. So it's all giving me soft edges and gradation because I'm working wet and wet. And it stayed in this area because the band below it, again, I dried completely. So that dry paper is going to resist the flow of that paint. And it's going to stay in the area where the paper is wet. Here I'm just putting a little bit of an edge of color along the base of that middle ground, that meadow area. Now I'm going to take a round wash brush, and I'm going to start to put in a wash to represent the kind of the reflection of the sky in the water. And it makes a nice backdrop for the tree and for the ground cover that's there. I started with peacock blue, and I'm adding a little bit of ultramarine blue to my mixture. And this is a kind of a middle value. And as I put this down, I'm going to come back with some water and work my way up. And it'll get lighter as I go up. So I've taken that all across, and now I'm going to take some clear water and go upwards. It still carries pigment with it, but it'll be lighter at the top once it's dry. I'm going to begin to paint these trees, and I'm going to use a 1/2-inch flat brush for this. And I'm working with a mixture of ultramarine blue and raw umber. So on the right side of that tree, I have a mixture that has a little bit more raw umber in it. And on the left side, I have a cooler mixture which has a little bit more ultramarine blue in it. They're merging together right now, but you'll see as I go on a little bit, it's going to be darker on the left side of that tree, the shadow side of that tree, and cooler. And I'm painting both these trees and bringing a wash down at the same time. And I'm going to come in with a rigger brush and start to take some of that pigment across some of that value and just give the indication of some branches here. So this is the same mixture as I've started on the tree trunk. It's the ultramarine blue and raw umber. As I put these branches, these indication of branches and twigs on here, I'm obviously not trying to copy specific branches or twigs from the photograph. I'm just rather suggesting that activity and trying to basically recreate a pattern that exists and sometimes textural qualities. So it's kind of a random application of these branches, but it's more an interpretation rather than trying to copy every branch. It's just trying to interpret and give the suggestion of that activity of branches and twigs. Here I'm taking a darker, cooler value and putting it on the shadow side of the larger tree and on the edge of the smaller tree. Here I've come back with a smaller rigger brush, and I'm giving more indication of this branch activity. So I have a medium dark value here. It's a mixture of this ultramarine blue and raw umber, and there's some areas where I put some darker values, but I'm just giving that suggestion through patterns and textures of this branch activity. Sometimes after I make some of these brush strokes, I'll come in with a fine mist spray and just mist these brush marks a little bit, and it softens them up a little bit in some areas. Just gives some variation of edge to these brush strokes. And my paper is still wet. I'm going to come in with a medium dark value green tone, and I'm just going to touch the brush to the paper in some areas and let the paint move around. And I'm just giving a suggestion here of this the greenery that's on the limbs of this tree. It's actually a pine tree, sparsely populated with some greenery at this part of the tree. So I've touched the brush to paper, and I'm splattering some of that paint into the wet, and it starts to move around on the wet paper. So it creates an interesting pattern and texture, and there's some nice soft edges and a few harder edges. My paper is still wet. I'm coming in with yet a darker green tone, so it just has more pigment of the same sap green, raw umber, and just a little bit of royal blue in there. But it's given a darker value, and I'm just adding it to some of the middle and light valued areas that I've already put down, and just still working wet into wet. Beside, I want a deeper blue in this water area, so I'm putting this darker band of blue here on the edge, and now I'm taking clear water and working it upwards, and it's giving me more of a gradation of this color in value. So it's darker in the foreground and gets lighter as it goes back. And that's not always the case. You could do just the opposite. You could go darker value in the back part of this body of water and lighter on the front edge. Normally, you don't want it flat. You want it to vary from light to dark or dark to light. Now I'm taking a darker value mixture of raw umber with a little bit of royal blue in it, not much, just a little bit to deepen it some. And I've got a 1/2 inch flat brush here, and I'm just giving the suggestion of this kind of grassy reed that's on the edge of this riverbank. I'm not trying to render this as much as I'm trying to create a pattern of brush marks that give this suggestion of this vertical grassy reed that's on the edge of this. I'm going to put a wash in here that's a mixture of sap green with a little pyro red in it and a little yellow ochre. And I'm just putting a large wash down to fill this shape. And I have the liquid masking fluid that was splattered in this area, so it's going to, in the end, it's going to give me a nice texture here. So I started with a lighter mixture of green. Now I'm coming in with a darker valued mixture of green, which is sap green with a little bit of raw umber. And I'm just giving the suggestion of these dark pockets, shadowed pockets in this grassy ground cover here in the foreground. And I've got a middle value here and a darker value. And then once I reach a point where I'm going to remove the masking fluid, I'll have all those little highlighted areas where I'll have white of the paper, and I'll come in with a very light wash of light green and yellowish green. And it'll give the suggestion of these bright leaves that are the sunlight's hitting with this backdrop of this more middle value and dark value green. In order for this to work, I had to think about my subject matter in advance and how I wanted to approach my painting. So if you don't do some upfront planning before you start putting the brush on the paper, you're not going to be able to preserve the whites and get those kind of textural quality highlights that I'm going to try and get with this painting. There's other ways to approach this, but this is a technique that I like to use when I'm doing landscapes such as this. I want a little bit more variation in my values here. Once I dried it, it lightened up quite a bit. So I'm going back in with a bit of a darker value. And this is a lot of raw umber. And it has just a little bit of royal blue in it, but not much. Now I'm going to take a rigger, kind of a medium rigger, with a darker value. It's raw umber with a little royal blue and a little bit of sap green in it. And I'm just coming off the edge here of this shoreline, or this grass, the edge of the grassy ground cover, and just making some marks to give the indication of saplings or branchy weeds that are growing in this kind of underbrush that's by these trees. So I'm not trying to pick out specific branches in my photograph. I'm just giving the suggestion of this ground cover with the sticks and the branches and the twigs sticking out of it. You can look at this photograph and see how it has all that activity coming off the ground. So I'm just trying to give the suggestion of that, and by my brush marks and the textures that I create. So I'm not taking a brush and trying to render each stick and leaf that appears in my photograph. I'm providing my interpretation of what I see. Here I've gone to a smaller rigger brush, and I'm making shorter, finer brush marks. They're still linear brush marks, given the suggestion of kind of grassy linear shapes that are coming off the ground cover there. And it's much thicker, a lot of overlap, and a denser suggestion of what's going on there. Same here. I'm trying to give more of the suggestion of grass than and less suggestion of saplings when I'm doing these types of brush strokes. So they're shorter and they are curvier, and they kind of run all together and actually start to form one shape. Now I've got a darker value that I'm coming in with the same smaller rigger brush and just making some darker valued marks. You'll see with this dark value and this small brush, I'm putting a variety of brush strokes down and changing the direction on some of these. You can see here this is very much at an angle almost perpendicular to the ground. But when you look at the type of plant life and trees and grass, you really have linear shapes and marks going in all different directions, different sizes, different lengths, some straight, some curved. So just trying to create that feeling that there's kind of a disarray on the ground. And so especially some of these marks that I'm putting right now, which make it look like there's sticks or twigs just laying flat on the ground, which there normally are when you encounter this type of a ground cover. While you often hear me talk about value contrast, these linear brush marks I've been making contrast one another in the way that some are straight and rigid and others are very curved and seem somewhat flexible. I'm taking a dark value and giving the indication of some pieces of leaves hanging on these branches, or some dried berries or some berries, and it breaks up some of that linear movement. And you often see these types of shapes, and when you're looking at ground cover such as this, it's not all linear. There's other more static shapes that are hanging on, and it helps provide balance to the composition, I feel. Here I'm continuing, but I'm making the marks a little bigger, a little blockier. So more of a suggestion of leaves on these branches. And you can see that I've introduced a bit of a green tone with these brush strokes, where the others were more of a warm, dark neutral. I'm going to put a darker value wash, just a small area, on the edge of this tree to just strengthen the shadow side of the shape. And I'm taking some of that darker value down into the ground cover too. So where I'm putting that dark value on that tree right there, there's some splattered masking fluid. So when I remove that and put a light wash of a yellow or yellow green on there, it's going to be a nice contrast because of the dark value around that light area. My reference photo has some darker shrubs or bushes coming in from the right, so I'm going to bring in a darker value here and introduce that coming in from the right side of my composition. This is a mixture of sap green still with some raw umber and a little bit of royal blue. I want to take that value on the other side of that tree. You never want to end a shape, and I brought out just a hair on the other side there. You don't want to end a shape on the edge of another shape if you can avoid it at all possible. It leaves the viewer wondering what happened. So when you're doing something like that, bringing a shape behind, such as here, you want to bring it out the other side of that object. And in this case, I brought it out a little bit too on the other side of the other tree. Again, I don't want to stop it just on the edge of that tree. I'm taking this value and just putting some touches of that darker value in these loose washes that I had early in my painting process. And just the suggestion of the leaves coming off the branch up here, that's kind of a loose wash to create that shape. And I'm softening those up with a spray. I want to bring the reflection of some of that green tone into the water. So I'm putting down a clear wash of water over top the blue. And I've left just a little bit of a gap between my wash and the shoreline, and it creates this nice light break between the reflection and the shore. And now I'm taking that darker green tone and just making some marks in that clear wash that I have. And it creates, because I'm going wet into wet, it creates a soft edge. But just giving the indication of some reflection of that green tone. Color seems a little flat there in that meadow, so I'm taking a wash of quinacridone gold and just going over the top of that to brighten it up. Here I've started to remove the masking fluid, and it's revealing the white areas of the paper that have been preserved. And it's not my intention to leave those white. I'm going to take a light wash of a green, light green, and a light yellow green, and make it appear to be the highlighted leaves and grasses in this foreground. So to get the effect I'm after, I'm using a wash of sap green, and I'm also using sap green with some cad yellow light, and I'm also using a permanent green #1 with some cad yellow light. And actually some areas I'll use just a little bit of cad yellow light, but I'm just glazing over this, and it's hard to paint the individual splatter marks, so I just put a general glaze over the area, and it gives me the effect that I'm after. Here at this point I've got pretty good coverage of these highlighted areas. I still have a little bit more to do, but you can see now that I have some of these the darker valued areas of green with the middle values of green, and then I have some of these highlighted areas that give a suggestion of sunlight hitting some of these areas, which makes them a bit brighter than the other areas and shapes. And that concludes my painting, Creek's Edge. I hope you enjoyed watching this painting develop. Be sure to check out Rick Sorwitz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook. And if you ever have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page of my website. And if you have specific questions, you can always email me at contactrsorwitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.